Hello! Nice to see everybody again. I am so fortunate today to have my wonderful, wonderful guest, Joan Schrouder, um, to accompany me today, and she's allowing me to interview her. And she's one of the people that I have always, always, always admired. Her knitting skill, her teaching skill. I've taken several classes from her many years ago, and she was one of my all-time favorite teachers. And one of the things that I really like about Joan is I love traditional knitting. I like knowing why you do something, how to do it, where to do it, how to fix it if you mess it up. And those are the things that she's about too. She's extraordinarily knowledgeable, one of the most knowledgeable people that I can even think of. In when you have an issue with knitting, Joan has an answer for you. She knows, and if she doesn't have an answer, she can help you figure it out. So I want to welcome everybody back again today. It's so nice to see you. I can see all your names over there. And I'm not going to read all your names off. I'm going to stop doing that because it's just really very, very, it's time consuming. I want to recognize that you're here, but I don't want to spend a lot of time doing it because I'd rather focus on my guest. So I want to welcome you, Joan, to my live stream. And the first question I'm going to ask you to start off our conversation is, how did you get involved with knitting to start with? What was it that drew you to it?
Oh my, well, I was like many others, about 8 years old. That seems to be kind of the golden age, I guess. I had learned to crochet the year before. I stayed with my grandmother for a week when my mom had one of my younger brothers, and grandma taught me how to crochet. And so I played with that for a few months, not really making anything, but just, repeating the same things over and over again. And somewhere in there, I must have had one of those little knitting Nancy's, but these are the old fashioned kind where you actually used a wooden spool with my dad pounded nails in it. And
My dad
we
did
probably
that
used
too.
a bent bobby pin to lift over. And again, just miles and miles of cord, which I think we probably braided or whatever. And then knitting came about when I was in the third grade, and we lived out in the country on a farm and had a fairly long ride to school every day in the bus and on the return trip later that afternoon. And one of my classmates, Mari Bowlby, her mother was an Australian war bride, had come back to this country after the war. And as any good Aussie, she knew how to knit, was teaching Mari how to knit. And I saw Mari knitting just this very simple garter stitch in variegated pink yarn, worsted weight yarn. And it just fascinated me. So I probably went home and got pencils or something of the same thing in mom's ball of darning yarn and started practicing. And she took pity on me and took me to the local dime store and got some regular needles and a skein of yarn. And I probably knit on that for years until it was just ragged beyond belief. So that's all I knew was garter stitch that first year. And then it was bits and pieces. A couple of years later, a friend visited my mom and showed me how to purl, and a neighbor lady switched me from English style yarn in the right hand to continental knitting, because every time I wrapped a stitch, I jerked the ever loving slack out of that thing. I couldn't even move the stitches on the needle. Here, let me help you figure this out. And since I had learned to crochet first, then continental did feel more at home.
That was the
So
same
that
with
was
me.
the
I
genesis.
crocheted and then went straight to continental knitting. I never even learned how to throw until I was, an adult.
Mm-hmm. Now, the only thing about it is the very first stitch that I ever learned how to do out of a little dime store pattern book put out by a yarn company was brioche. I didn't know that. They didn't call it brioche there, but there was a yarn over involved. Well, the yarn over I learned how to do in crochet wrapped over the needle from back
Oh,
to front.
right.
So I did it the same way in knitting, but then it was a different order.
Right.
So I reversed the way I wrap my yarn on all my knitting stitches too.
Oh, Eastern style
And
knitter.
I was, but I didn't know. Well, I at some point with stockinette, I figured out,
Uh-huh.
work into the leading leg, which in that case is the back leg. But it really changed brioche. This is the very first sweater I ever designed in about 8th grade. And this is my brioche
Oh,
stitch in 2 colors, but it
oh,
looks nothing like brioche
that's Joan's
because
brioche.
that's Joan's brioche. And it
Yes,
has a different, this was 2 rows of one color, 2 rows of the other.
that's
And it has
beautiful.
a totally different look on the other side. And it wasn't until a few years ago when I got it back out that I realized that one front is the reverse side of the other. So it's like I made 2 right fronts and then flipped
Right,
one of them over
right.
because I didn't notice the difference there. But it was
Oh,
done in pieces and sewn together. I even did a little bit of an armhole shape
wow.
because I had enough basics. My mom had taught me how to sew, but that didn't stick very well. She was trying to help me learn to do it well, which involved ripping out seams and redoing them. And that just frustrated the
Not
hell out of
fun.
me.
Right.
So I gravitated to knitting, I think purely out of rebellion because she didn't knit. My grandmother didn't knit. Nobody in my family, other than these just occasional visitors. So I could do it any way I wanted,
Right,
which is why
right.
I knit wrapping the other direction until I was 30, I think, before I finally kind of realized it would probably make my life easier to relearn to wrap the other direction when I got into some lace patterns. They were a little bit more complex of
Right.
flipping everything around again. So at that point, I stopped and made myself relearn.
Wow, how interesting. So, that was the same with me. There weren't any knitters in my family, so I didn't have anybody critiquing my knitting either.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I just figured that's how you did it. That's what the continental thing I learned to knit from a book, from pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just looking at pictures, and I learned crocheting first, so I just assumed you hold the yarn in the same hand,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't know any different till I was an adult. I didn't even ever see anybody else knit, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
when did you get more serious about knitting? So that's when you were little. Then what happened?
Well, I didn't do very much at all through high school. I made this sweater, a cardigan, and a little pullover. And I even have, like, in my yearbook, I must have worn the pullover for, picture day or something like that. There was some pictures in there, but I didn't really do much of it until I was expecting my first baby. It was what, 25 or so, 24, 25. And started knitting a christening shawl that had a very elaborate lace edging on it, really wide one that increased and had short rows and everything. And the first time or two I tried it, I couldn't quite. I was always ending up at the end of the row with a couple stitches left over. The next time I tried, I'd run out of stitches. And there was a class that was advertised through the community center where you could come and bring whatever project you were working on and somebody would help you with it. So I signed up for that. And when I got to the class, I discovered that I could, then it finally worked out. That must have been the magic time through, third time through or whatever. And so I'd already paid for the class, so I went ahead and attended the other sessions. And as I was hearing other questions to the instructor, it dawned on me that I get the gist of that. And I'd started knitting some sweaters, and some were following patterns, some I was designing. And it wasn't until after my son was born, and I'm quite sure he was just a newborn, and I was poking through a bookstore and found Elizabeth Zimmerman's Knitting Without Tears was my first knitting book. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is what now makes everything make sense. because I figured things out as I was going, but I didn't really get the whole gist of why things were working the way they did. And she just filled in the gaps, and that was it. That's when it really took off.
So, same thing with me when I found Elizabeth Zimmerman's Knitting Without Tears, because, um, and also other, like Anna Zilberg has her
Mhm.
book that, it's okay. It's
Mhm.
just okay. It's okay to not, you don't have to follow the rules exactly. If it makes sense to you, you can do it the way you want to do it. It's your knitting, it's your needles, it's your yarn, you know,
Mhm.
and give you permission to not have to follow the rules in the magazine, you know
Mhm.
and that opened my eyes tremendously to just playing around with the needles and the yarn and trying different things and
Mhm.
trying to replicate something that I saw rather than
Mhm.
reading directions. Although I don't mind reading directions, but sometimes I don't necessarily agree with the directions. So,
Right. Somewhere in there, I started looking every time I went into a bookstore, I would look to see what they had. Well, this was mid 70s. So I found Barbara Walker that way, the first treasury, got the second treasury, Elizabeth's first book, then Inner's Almanac a year or two later, and so on. And somewhere in there, I came across a book called The Right Way to Knit.
oh,
And so, of course, I got it. And, it was an interesting thing in that she had very strong opinions about, well, don't ever slip the first stitch of the row, and a couple of other things. And I'd been slipping the first stitch of the row because ever since, with brioche stitch, typically you do. And I really like the edging. So I started using it for everything. And what I realized was that people have opinions, but just because they write it down, in years earlier, because I was kind of a rule follower, I might have accepted that as gospel, but I'd already had the experience that, no, well, I tried that. I like it. And how I got around the issues of that, and people do have the thing as far as with slipping the first stitch. Well, it's hard to, you can't do a decent mattress stitch.
right.
Well, okay, but then take it a step further. I found, I think, 4 or 5 different ways to seam up short slip stitch edges to make decorative seams. So, you don't just stop at that point. You go on and say, okay, well, now how am I going to? Is
Right.
it a way I can pick up from that and turn it into a design feature? Since it looks so pretty, why hide it? And
Exactly.
that already, just seeing it written just absolute as an absolute, and realizing that, I already had differing viewpoints, gave me the confidence to trust my own judgment, to take under advisement what they might offer. Because otherwise, in the book, I did find a neat little clue about a certain kind of buttonhole that I later expanded upon and came up with my own buttonholes that I've never seen, anybody else write up or use. And so I could still get the nuggets, but I could discard or at least put that in another pile, that I didn't have to accept it as gospel, that what was written was the only way.
Exactly. Exactly. So I know you went to knitting camp
Yeah,
probably
yeah.
quite a few times. So how did you get the connection between her book and going to knitting camp?
I read about knitting camp in Knitting Magazine. Knitting World came out somewhere in the mid 80s or thereabouts. And one of the original people who was a columnist there, Joyce Slayton, had, every issue. And I think this is maybe only the second or third issue of that magazine, but I, always kept an eye in the grocery store magazine stands if there was a new magazine, which there weren't that many. to subscribe to, and she wrote about it. And so I sent a letter to her in care of the magazine, and then she also mentioned that it was under the University of Wisconsin extension courses. So I wrote a letter to them, and I don't remember who answered first. I did get letters from both about it. And I mulled so hard because I had never flown anywhere by myself. I'd flown twice in my lifetime. My husband had made, the arrangements. I had a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old or something like that. I had arranged for babysitting. I had to take time off from work. It was a little bit of a push on the budget and trying to figure out, and finally just said, I'm going to go. And I don't think I slept for a week before I went. I was so excited. And so nervous. And I went, and it was, everything I dreamed it would be. And she was just utterly charming, very sweet. We had a class in a high school because it was during the summertime, so classes were out there, and we were in the high school library. I think there were about 25 of us there, so it was a big class, but the idea being that everybody already knew how to knit, and we stayed in this kind of a dorm style surroundings. And then later Joy was there because she went back, and so did a number of the other people. And then that got me to thinking, I guess this maybe doesn't have to be a one-time only. Right. So I think I went for about 20 times total, mostly in a row. But towards the end there, I kind of sporadically missed because sometimes there were other things happening at the same time.
Right. So what we're talking about, for those who don't know, knitting camp was the knitting camp that Elizabeth Zimmerman put on. Her daughter still puts it on. Meg Swanson puts it on every year. But initially it was put on by Elizabeth Zimmerman herself.
And there was just the one session a summer, and then gradually as more people signed up, they would have several. So then we'd kind of all shoot letters back and forth or phone calls because there was this
which one were you going to be in? Yeah, exactly.
Go back because you wanted to see the same people again. But I started going in 79 was the and I think that was the 4th or 5th one. It started with 74 or 75, somewhere in there. And then, like I say, nowadays they have at least 3 or 4 sessions, plus they may go has a couple of other, they don't call them camp, but now it's at a nice motel, like I say, that the facilities have definitely upgraded, but the camaraderie and, meeting some of these people and over again, and you got friends all over the country, and some of them were writing for the magazine. And then I remember meeting Sidna Farley there. She started, I think, next year after. And she lived in Denver, so I would fly to Denver. She would get on there. We would fly to Minneapolis. Another friend, Jerry, who lived in South Dakota at the time, would pick us up. And then we started arranging to come a couple days early and shop around. And we got friends in Minneapolis. And then after camp, we would go sightseeing. We went to Spring Green to Frank Lloyd Wright's place in central Wisconsin. And, we just had so many adventures along the way that became such a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then Sidna started teaching for TKGA and kept bugging me to send in proposals. And so I finally did.
Yes, so, and that's where I met you. That's where I met you, at a TKGA conference. Yep.
Yeah, the networking that started coming. One year at camp, Alexi Zanakis and Elaine Rowley from Knitters Magazine, that had just started a couple of years prior, came over and spent some time at the camp. And of course, they were big Elizabeth fans and talked to us. And that's where I met them. And they saw a sweater I had and invited me to submit it. So I started sending some patterns for designs for consideration in the magazine, and they published several over the years. And then when they started Stitches, they already had our names in the database to submit proposals. So yeah, it just became this wonderful snowball of interlinking with each
Yes.
other prior to when we had anything internet-wise.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. So Trevster, he says he has a comment or a question. He says, Joan, would you ever consider writing a book on knitting tips and wisdom? You have so much knowledge to offer.
Uh-uh. I've been asked before, but I've known too many people who write books, and I don't have the energy, the self-discipline to stick to it. So I started out on the Knit List, writing answers to questions, and then Knit You, and now Ravelry. And you'll just have to, I mean, the nice thing about Ravelry, at least as long as it exists, is that you can go back and pull up my any of my sayings,
Right.
my posts. You can, and they're searchable. That's what I really like.
Yes.
You go to my profile page and click on the 80,000+ posts, and then write a topic, short rows, or
Or you can search it.
you
Exactly.
can search it and then find
So
anything.
that brings up, talking about Ravelry, before Ravelry and Knitting Universe, there was, remember Yahoo groups?
Yeah, the Knit List, and then there were offshoots from that. I started
Yes.
on the Knit List, I think, in '96, because that's the first time I got a modem
Right,
and
me too.
email.
But that was
Mhm.
so hard to find anything, to
Mhm.
search through, and the threads and the conversation. And then before Ravelry, there was also Clara Parks had her Knitter's Review. Remember that? Which I think she
I
still
do.
has.
Yeah, I didn't make as much use of it as I probably should have. I think I heard about it, and I don't know why I didn't follow up more on that.
Right.
But
It was a good forum, and that's where I first learned about I wanted to learn more about stranded knitting, and so I learned
mhm,
about Alice Starmore there, and kind of went down
mhm.
that hole for a while. And that's where I heard about Ravelry, was from Knitter's Review.
Huh.
Somebody started talking about Ravelry, and then and I agree. I think Ravelry, it goes down in history as a big thing for knitting, a big
Oh,
thing
I
for knitting.
agree. I
You
think
know,
in years prior to that, there was always a wax and wane of interest in knitting, and you would see, a bunch of magazines come out, and yarn shops were just popping up right and left. And then over, 10 years, a few of them would go by the wayside, and pretty soon there was not as many magazines, or you were kind of iffy about the quality of the magazines, or at least your interest in them.
right?
And then for a while, it didn't seem like you could find hardly anything. But I think, the internet, ways for people who had never knit with anybody in far off places, being connected, learning about, knitting conventions and so on. And yet that still, appeals to just a specific group, because not everybody has the financial means, or the
Right.
time off, or the
Right. The resources.
locale
Yeah.
to make that happen. And yet I think there are a lot of, particularly women, who had never considered that, hey, their spouses go on fishing trips or golfing jaunts. Why not?
Right.
I remember meeting this one physician, who was telling her colleagues what she was taking time off because she was going to a convention, and their ears would perk up because, oh, is this something I should be going to? And she'd say it's a knitting convention, and they were, mostly puzzled at the whole idea of going to something that what they considered was probably an archaic
Right. Right.
thing. And yet you want to say there's more knitters in the world than there are golfers.
Oh yeah. And another thing about Ravelry that I really like, that it's such a mine of information.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when Ravelry first started, there were a lot of shawls, a lot of shawls, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
shawl designers, and then Cookie A became popular, and suddenly there were socks
Mm-hmm.
all over the place. Socks, socks,
Mm-hmm.
socks, socks, socks. And then you started seeing some sweaters, but a lot of worsted weight and bulky sweaters, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and it has evolved, and now it's this fine, fine, fine knitting, you
Yeah.
know. You can just see, and all the ravelers have evolved too. You know,
Mm-hmm.
all these people the people that have been on there, you know, for a long time have been on this journey, this transition of the beauty of knitting and the intricacy and the architecture and
Mm-hmm.
the you know, it's not just knitting, you
Oh
know.
yeah, yeah. It's as much about the creative process and expanding your skill set and then adjusting or changing things from a set pattern. And it just opens up so many more options than we ever had before. And customizing fit, because how many of us actually have a standard
Body,
size?
right?
Mhm.
Exactly. So, how, other than going to knitting camp, how
Mhm.
have you educated yourself on knitting?
I think books that, for a long time, I just picked up whatever I could find. And then once I discovered Elizabeth Zimmerman and that she had Schoolhouse Press, because that's immediately what Joy said, your mind will be blown because they
Yes,
carry books. And
yes.
the neat thing about the books that they carry is they often did European import, books that were in other languages that you didn't necessarily know, that weren't translated, but because a lot of the pattern was color work, there were charts.
Charts, yes.
So you didn't have to necessarily knit the sweater on page 72. You would take the charts from page 72 and using Elizabeth's percentage system, and maybe Barbara Walker's knitting from the top down if you wanted to switch things around, and you could construct whatever it was you want in the weight yarn you wanted for the size person you wanted. And that was, a game changer.
Yes.
So I picked up a lot of the books. It's only been, probably the last 15 years that I found that I really had to kind of cut down on the book acquisition, because anymore there were 40, 50, 60, 70 books coming out per year.
Yes.
And I was more on the lookout for technique oriented ones, or ethnic
Skills and ethnic or
skills.
traditional. Yeah,
Yeah, the
not just
traditional kind of
patterns.
things.
Not just
and
patterns.
and I still use that information a lot. I like things that have their roots in some traditional, and yet at the same time, how much fun it is to not be hidden bound by some of the rules that those places had. I know, originally, I kind of, after I read a lot about traditional knitting, I kind of thought, well, I'm now I have German ancestry, so Bavarian stitches did feel kind of okay. I'm back home again,
Uh-huh.
but I love Farrow knitting and Shetland lace and other kinds of things too. And then I met a woman one time who was from Estonia, and she said that even though she'd been gone from Estonia for 50 years, she felt almost compartmentalized, that she could only knit patterns that were indigenous to not only Estonia, but to her region of Estonia, that only worked with certain color ranges.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that maybe sometimes having freedom to pick and choose and combine elements of different things was a better. So I no longer kind of lamented a lack of a strong,
Right.
uh, ingrained pattern selection for myself.
So tell us a little bit about the sweater that you're wearing today.
This was one that was probably 30 years old. It's knit from the top down, and if you're familiar with top down raglans, this is similar to that, only you divide the neckline into equal quadrants.
So the
Yep.
increases are here, here, and here.
And you do the two increases every other round. And I've seen many ponchos knit like that, but often the fabric gets really voluminous. And what I realized is that I would keep trying this on, and when it got as wide as my shoulders were, then I would slow down the rate of increasing on the shoulder ones. So now these guys are only increasing every fourth round while I keep the front and back center increase going. And then I had bought, I I love to paint myself in corners. I buy yarn on sale, and there's only, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were only 6 skeins of the red and black dot.
Wow, that's beautiful.
So I ran out. So I found some black yarn, which of course I've been striping in there as I went. And the sides are knit in garter stitch. I cast on enough stitches to meet the diagonals across here. But the trick was I couldn't do that with the same weight yarn. I had to use, let me figure out what will show. What this is the square, the diagonal, the hypotenuse of here is 1.7 times the height of this triangle, the legs of the triangle. So I had to have a ratio of gauge that would work 1.7 times. So if this is worsted weight of 5 to the inch, 1.7 times that was 7 stitch, 1.4, I'm sorry, I misspoke, was 1.4 times 5 is 7 stitches to the inch. So by getting a fingering weight yarn and casting on, and then it's basically short rows, you're just joining back and forth and picking up a live stitch from the bottom.
Very cool. That is gorgeous.
And then I did split it at the side seams and just do a little shirt tail hem. And then the underarms are same way. I picked up from the provisional cast on here and filled that in so that this the sleeve came out even. So and the other fun thing about this, I just let it, this is one full skein in this stripe. This was a full skein in this stripe, a full skein in this stripe. So because you're increasing numbers of stitches,
the stripes get narrower.
Rows. Right. So it automatically sequenced all the way through, and I just let it be and had just a few tails of yarn that were yay number. And it actually, I think it turned out something like 10, 8, 6, 4, 2 rows or something like that, very incrementally. Mathematically predictable, which I didn't know until the end, and then went back and looked at it.
Right, so. Right. That's the thing, when I teach a lot of knitting classes, when I bring up the word math, people's eyes glaze over. Yeah. And I always tell them, if your brain enjoys knitting, it's math. It's just a way that you haven't ever thought about math before, and it's okay.
It's more applicable. I've told many of my students, I said, if back in, 3rd, 4th grade, if in those math problems, if instead of those blankety blank trains going to Chicago at different speeds, we'd said, okay, Mary's going to cast on the sweater and she needs it to be 37 inches. And she's working at 5 stitches to the inch, and she's using a stitch pattern that's 6 stitch repeat. How many stitches should she cast?
Right, exactly.
Our eyes would have lit up and we'd say, okay, I'm there.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think, that's when our eyes glazed over back then, with those freaking trains.
I know. It didn't apply. First of all, I'd never been on a train. You just saw them. So when you became involved in Ravelry, and you kind of gravitated towards answering people's questions in the technique threads, right?
Yeah, technique and patterns were the primary ones, and then I had joined other groups that interested me. So then if there were questions posed there, but to me, it was just an extension of exactly what I'd done on Knit List and Knit You, where people wrote in and saying, I'm having a hard time understanding this pattern, or I need to modify the pattern. What do I do here? you know, and the advantage Ravelry had is you could post a picture of what your work looked like. So you could, you know, we could see what
Right.
was going on and sometimes pick up something that wouldn't have been apparent just in their description. And I think
Exactly.
that's also been something that's been an interesting thing for me to do, because especially sometimes someone who is relatively new to knitting doesn't necessarily have the vocabulary yet. So sometimes being able to read between the lines to figure out what it is they're really asking. And then sometimes I just totally blow it out of the water and I totally miss what it was they're saying. I've, you know, I've had that happen too. But more often than not, I've been able to figure that out. And that makes me feel good, because then we can get right to the solution part of it much quicker before they get, you know, because you can almost read between the lines and see the frustration mounting. And it's true, I think once our frustration level gets a certain level, it's really hard to be analytical.
Yes, yes. So someone I asked here on here, how many sweaters do you have?
I've never counted. I probably have 10 sitting here in a chair in case, you know, we get bored and
No,
want to go
let's
do
talk
things.
about your sweaters. I want to talk about that one in the back that's on the mannequin first, the one that's the county yarn.
Yes.
That's my favorite sweater that on your
I can
projects.
see why. I think the colors are just
Yeah, they're
you.
mine. I'm going to inherit that sweater.
Well, it would probably be rather big on you. It's rather big on me now because I have lost some weight, but intentionally, everything was exactly what I planned. But yeah, this one was my own design, and ever since I first saw the county sweaters, for those who don't know, county is about it's actually closer to a fingering weight. They call it a sport weight because you can, you know, moosh the gauge out to about 6, but it can also work down at about 7 to the inch. And it's a gradient color. There are
Long gradient.
two very long, you know, it isn't like Noro where their stripes go every few rows or rounds. This really goes through a long transition. And in this particular one, I used 2 balls of the same yarn, but there were 2 things that I discovered when I was researching, because there was a real popular pattern for a while out on Ravelry called Rainbow Cardigan by Ruth Sorensen from Denmark. And, you know, everybody was throwing those out right and left. So of course, by the time I got my yarn, I wanted to do something different, but I picked up on what Ruth had done that made it work. And that was, when you have 2 balls of the same yarn, you obviously don't want to start at the same place in the colorway, because then you can't see the pattern. There has to be contrast. So I deliberately chose balls that started at different points of the colorway. And so in this case, let's see if I can pull this up close enough. I started with yellow, orange and blue, which are opposite on the color wheel. And the other trick you have to do is to use a chart that has equal amounts of background and pattern. Because if you do not do that, then it's like being on a, say, on a track, running laps, and you're going at one speed and somebody else is going at a little bit faster speed. Eventually they're going to catch up to you.
And be
You
on the
might
same color. Yeah.
Yeah, you might start at the opposite sides, but eventually one's going to catch up on the other. And other things I've seen people recommend is start at opposite balls of the yarn. Well, it's going to be the same thing. If you and a runner start on opposite sides of the track, but you end up running past each other, you're going to cross over much more frequently. So by choosing this particular stitch pattern I found in a treasury of color stitch patterns was equal. It was, you know, I forget what, I think it was 18 stitches wide and I forgot how many rows high. But if you multiply the stitch width and
Right.
times row
Same
width,
number of each color.
square,
Yeah.
then count them up, it had equal amounts. So therefore, if I started at the opposite, then I should pretty much stay opposite all the way through. So those are the 2 rules then. And so I actually knit the body twice because the first time through my gauge was a little off. And so I think but I liked the gauge I got. So I ended up redoing it with, I think, another repeat added in there. And the other thing I did was I mirrored it on either side of the center line of the steek where I was going to cut it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the back where you don't have a cut also has that same mirror. And if you plot it just right, here's my center line, which I realize you're probably not that close to doing. I found a place in the chart that I could do that. So again, I was never more than 5 stitches in a row the same color. So I never had to do any weaving in.
Right. So look at how those colors glow together. It's just so beautiful. Unbelievably gorgeous.
It was so much fun to do. The fact that I had to redo the body a second time wasn't even terribly burdensome because it was so magical to see it evolve out. And then I cut the armholes and picked up around the armholes, and I did knit some back and forth, which I've learned to knit backwards because I like having the right side facing me so that I could make sure I was doing the pattern correctly, because if you're on the wrong side row, you might not notice it because you can't really see what you're doing very well.
Right.
And then in this one, I have the decreases down the top center of the sleeve instead of at the underarm. And I actually like that shaping better because that ends up...
You're not like this. You're not like this.
Exactly.
You're like this.
Yeah, and then as soon as you do that, you let your arm down, you have all the fabric underneath, because that's the long diagonal. I put my diagonals often at the top of the sleeve, and that because that's a longer measurement from your top of your shoulder down to the cuff. And then the cuffs are done in a oh, it's really dark. I don't know if you can see that. If you go to the page on it's called Turkish. I've got photographs there, but it's done in garter stitch in color stranding, which means you do every row of the chart twice because you have to do it in one row of knit and one row of purl.
Right.
You do the same color above. And then the other kind of cool thing on this, well, again, we'll see if I can get it up enough, at least it's lighter, is that the bottom is done in garter stitch.
Yes.
But often when you do garter stitch and then change it to stockinette all in one,
you get bicolored pearls. Yeah.
Well, it isn't so much that, because again, I was following the same thing before, as doing the second row or repeating the second row in pearls, but I didn't stop doing stockinette on all the colors or switch to stockinette on all the colors, because when you have a hard line between garter and stockinette, it often wants to flip.
Right.
So in this case, I kept doing garter stitch in the blue for 2 ridges more than the orange. So if you look at the garter, it's kind of a zigzaggy pattern. So there's no horizontal line for flipping. And that prevents any purl.
So Meg Swanson has that thing in the ribbing for stranded knitting. She calls it purl when you can. For the same thing. It's the same sort of concept, a little bit different, but it's the idea of preventing the fabric from rolling, but maintaining your stranded pattern.
Right. And of course, you would just, when she says purl when you can, it's when you're purling the same color above the previous.
So you don't have bicolored pearls.
The opposite color, then you get that blip. So your pattern is less defined.
Yes. So, there's 2 more questions. One is from Show and Tell Knitting, wants to know, what is your background, your education background, because you seem so logical.
I'm a registered nurse, or I was one. I'm actually retired now and have let my license lapse. So I went to nursing school after high school and worked for 30 some years as a nurse in amongst having children, but was fortunate, the nice thing about nursing is I could work part-time. And so that could fit into my, traveling. And of course, before the traveling was the
Yeah, and
nursing,
I
and I
think
got my
with the
Cascade
medical
too.
training, it is logical, but I think it's
Mhm.
more problem solving. And
Yeah.
because my training is similar too, and I really enjoy the problem solving portion
Mhm.
of knitting. You know,
I've
um,
often thought that, if I had it to do over again, would I go into engineering or architecture or something like that?
right.
That made a lot more money,
Right. Engineering. Well, when
possibly.
I was, when we were in junior high,
Mhm.
you took that testing before you went to high school to see what your aptitude was. Mine
Mhm.
came out engineering, but my high school counselor said women don't go into engineering.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because you and we discussed before, a similar vintage. And
Yes,
so at that time, it was kind of clerical nursing or teaching. And among those,
exactly.
nursing was, and I had family, I was the sixth cousin to graduate from the same school of nursing, and I had a couple of cousins and an aunt who were in other programs. But yeah, one of my younger brothers later, the one who was born when I was doing the crocheting class, later became a physician. And there was a few moments there where I thought, well, why didn't I do that? And it just hadn't occurred to me. But yeah, in retrospect, I don't regret it at all, because it was a much more flexible,
Right, exactly.
freer, because you put all that extra time and effort into being a doctor, and it's very hard to just go to part-time
Right. You're
or
invested, you're financially
um,
invested in maintaining that career. So
um,
there's another question. This is by Trevster. Joan, could you tell us a little bit about your work in the Bohus tradition and poems of color?
oh yes, I happen to have that sweater here. That was another favorite project. I knit the sweater, the model that was in Wendy Keel's book,
Wow.
and I was so pleased. We actually, let's see, we met shortly before she did the book. I had a Bohus sweater, and Sidna Farley again was the instigator. She knew Wendy, and she knew me, and she knew Wendy was doing some investigation about doing this book. So she says, I want to vouch for her that if you'll send her the sweater, you'll believe that you'll get it back. So I did. I sent it to her, and so then when she was getting close to writing her book, she sent me a letter and said, would you be willing to knit a sample? And do you know any other knitters? Because where she lived in a fairly rural area, she says, we just don't have a lot of knitters. So I recruited several other of my friends who also knit sweaters. So I got to knit this one. And it was a real challenge. It was the first time I'd ever knitted 3 colors in one row, which there are only just a few of. But I tweaked the directions a bit. I did a provisional cast on for the neckline, because I like to do my neckline ribbings later and figure out how to fit them better. So I need to have the rest of the yoke there to see where it's going to sit. So then the body was knit down, and I did not do the short row below the yoke like was directed in there, to raise the back of the neck, because at the time I had a lot of discrepancy in my row gauge between knit and purl. So I knew in a light color that would show up. And I hadn't thought it through to figure out that if you purl with a smaller needle, that would offset that.
Right.
So anyway, I cut it, and then I picked up along the front and cast on for my button band, and knit my button band back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and then just joined it as I went by knitting the last stitch together with a picked up stitch, and threw in some buttonholes wherever I put my markings. And then once I got up to the top, I knit up my stitches from my provisional cast on, and I have my short rows in my ribbing.
Oh, yes, I do that.
And
Yeah.
this is, let's see, I knit this in 95, so more than 25 years old. And I still do this all the time. I add my short rows in there because, number one, they don't show if there's a rowing out issue. They blend right in. It's real easy to do. And I also kind of solidified my premise is that especially on these round yokes, I count the number of stitches and then divide in 4 equal quadrants. And the back quadrant is going to have the first short row. And then I'm going to go back and forth and knit up a few more stitches through those shoulder sections until I've gotten all the way. And the only amount of stitches that haven't been short rowed are the front quadrant.
Right.
And it doesn't matter if you eke in, you know, a stitch or two, that's okay. So then all I have are these shoulder sections, and then how many stitches to add each time depends on how many rows you want to do. So you multiply your row gauge times how many extra inches, and then that tells you how many extra rows you need. And each time you're doing a pair of rows, so divide that number in half, and then divide that number into the number of stitches. And I think mine added, you know, like three more stitches each time, and that got me the necessary to get through those shoulder quadrants. And I mean, it's really, really, really easy, you know, once you have that basic kind of a formula. And I do that on all my top-down sweaters now.
So another interesting thing you said a while back is, you know, Elizabeth Zimmerman did her sweaters bottom up, and Barbara Walker did the top down book. And so to take from both of those and put that information together. There's another good book I really liked. It was The Sweater Workshop by Jacqueline Fee. That was one of the first books I got too. And between that and Elizabeth Zimmerman and Priscilla Gibson Roberts, Knitting in the Old Way, you know, if you have those books, you can knit anything. You can literally knit anything.
Yeah, I know sometimes people kind of poo-poo Elizabeth Zimmerman's because they're so old-fashioned. And yeah, they were written in the 60s and 70s, but the basic principles are still golden. And, you know, the certain percentages, she even modified over time. Meg's modified them some more. And there's nothing wrong with modifying them.
It gives you a starting point. And then once you learn your body, you know, you can apply it to your body. Because like I'm tall, I have long arms, you know, and so I do things a little bit different for me, but it gives you a starting point. And it also, I did a article one time for Cast On Magazine. I actually compared Elizabeth Zimmerman's with Priscilla Gibson Roberts and Barbara Walker. I compared them all together, and they're so similar. They're so similar. You know, they have their small differences, but they were all looking at the same situation from different angles. Yep.
Yeah, it's the relationship between portions of the body that then, you know, will make sense.
And Elizabeth Zimmerman's things are so like the rib warmer. I've knit a bunch of those. I just love them. They have so many interesting elements. They're so simple, but at the same time so interesting, that how she put it together and how you can play with it. It's just, to me, sometimes simplicity is genius.
Exactly. Getting to the nut or the core of the whole thing. I do a lot of my sweaters kind of from the middle out. That because as I mentioned earlier, I often would buy yarn on sale. I buy yarn on spec, or I have bought yarn on speculation. I'm pretty much on a yarn diet now because I have so much I just need to use. Because all that travel, you know, when you go to the marketplace,
right? It calls your name. It just calls your name. You have to get it.
Oh my gosh! And yarn, it's amazing how much you can compress into a suitcase. And, you know, I always figured whatever space my handouts took that were a concrete size,
yarn home.
I could mash a lot of yarn into that. But so now I'm. You know, the question then is, how do I use the amount of yarn I have? And at the same time, I don't want to dip into something that I have 20 skeins of and only use 17. I'll save it for a bigger project. But, you know, Ravelry works great. About 5 years ago, I put most all of my stash into Ravelry's database. And it took me 2 months, about an hour a day, because I had so much, taking photographs and so on. But man, has that been useful, because I'll look at a pattern I'm considering, and okay, for my size, I need this yardage, and I'll pull up the weight what do I have? You know, if I need 1,500 yards, what do I have between 1,450
Yeah,
and
it's like shopping. It's
17
shopping in
shopping?
your own
And
stash. Yes.
you've got, you know, 5 or 6 to look at instead of everything else. Plus, I know approximately where it
Yeah,
is.
you don't have to dig through everything.
And I
Exactly.
can tag it for that project. So later on, if I go back to start to use some, oh, I had to tag for 3 other projects. Are they more compelling to do than this other? So yeah, it's given me a lot to work with.
That's something we can talk about in a second too. There's another question here is which type of short row turn do you like to use?
Good old wrap and turn. It's the one I learned the first. I know how to do it in my sleep, and I've played with the others, and I go back to wrap and turn every single time.
I did a study on all the short row turns. I have a swatch. I call it the monster swatch. And I have
Mhm.
all of them on there. And you know, they pretty much all look the same. There's
Yeah, yeah. I
very,
mean,
very,
some of
very, you would
yeah,
have to have a magnifying glass and look at them very carefully. And some of them you still can't tell the difference. It's just doing the same thing in a different way. It's
right,
still
right.
skinning a cat, you know?
Mhm,
We talked yesterday when we were getting ready to do this
mhm,
about the depth of Ravelry. Not just the forums, not the forums. The forums are great. And what you were talking about for searching keywords and stuff like that, where you can find, that's awesome. That's awesome. But the other parts of Ravelry, for example, you said putting your stash on there. So you put your
mhm,
stash, let's say you have a yarn that you
mhm.
love and you have no idea what you want to make with it. You could just look up that yarn and see what other people did with that yarn, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Or,
And that's particularly helpful, for instance, like with variegated yarns or gradient yarns, because especially with variegated, they're a tough animal to control. And some patterns would just sing with them, and then 97% would just fight, and you would
look
just
like
be
mud. I say they look like mud.
devastated. So seeing what others have done, you know, not only what looks good, but what can you check off your list, because it just, you know, if every single lace pattern you see in it just doesn't work, okay, confine that, you know, eliminate that as an option and go look at the others, because finding sometimes what doesn't work is as valuable to you as finding what
Yes,
does.
exactly. Narrows your possibilities down. I also like when people document their process on their
Right.
project pages because you can
Uh-huh.
learn so much. And there are some people that I follow just because I like to read their
Yeah.
processes on their documents, yeah, on their project pages.
And I want to give a shout out to those people too, because as someone who answers a lot of questions, I use that as a resource because I often don't have that particular pattern. And by seeing what other people have written about, you know, because once you pull up the projects, you can put a keyword in and just find the projects that Ravelers have addressed that particular issue, and just focus in on those, and then direct, you know, put links into your post to say, check these out. These will really help you figure out where you're going with that idea.
And they have another thing that they just started in the last couple of years is where you can actually list more than one pattern for your project. So if
Yeah,
you used
use
what
elements.
elements of this pattern, elements of that
Mhm,
pattern, you know, that's an awesome tool too. Um,
mhm.
so you were voted a human of Ravelry.
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
such an honor.
it,
Such a,
it very much
you
was.
truly are a human of Ravelry. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I thank you, and that did really make me feel good that that most everyone, you know, obviously who voted or whatever would find what I've written helpful, because usually that's my goal. I mean, sometimes I answer stuff just being a wiseacre and, you know, making a smart blanky blank comment, but because I want to have some humor in there too. I have always been a strong proponent of using that as well. But to think, because there are a lot of people who put in tons, you know, there are people who have twice as many posts as I have, and they're almost always in response to people's questions and answers. And so, you know, being in there with some of the others who've who've done similar over the years has really been
And it's really
useful.
just goodwill. It is
Mhm.
goodwill on your part because you don't get compensated for that. You know, it's something because you
It's just for
have,
glory.
it's because of, but your love of knitting. It's your love of knitting
Exactly.
and your love of helping other people love knitting.
Well, and it's a way of feeling like all of this stuff, from experience and whatever, how it has somewhere else to be useful. It's like being the queen of Trivial Pursuit, and other than getting on Jeopardy, I suppose there's not a whole lot you can do with that. Because even at a cocktail party, people are only going to listen to you for about half a drink and off they go. So to have an audience for something that most people don't have any interest in, but there is a place for it, and to pass it on and get people excited, to get them over a hurdle. Because I think learning to be analytical, I think that's one of the things I've tried to push, is that when we have something that doesn't work, spend a few minutes if you want to, and just go through the, oh geez, why did I do this stupid thing or whatever, but then get into Mr. Spock mode and look at it and say, okay, what went askew? Because it's only through analyzing it that you can ever figure out, just identifying the problem, and then what are your options to fix that, is to get you beyond that, so you don't have to make that same mistake again. Because there's a
Yes.
hell of a lot of new mistakes you can
Yeah,
make.
that's
Why not be creative with them?
exactly. I always tell people the better the knitter you are, the bigger the mistakes you make. You know, the
Yeah,
more
yeah,
complicated the mistakes are, and then to then figure them out, and go back so you don't
yeah.
have to reproduce it again. So let's see some of the sweaters that you have out to share.
Oh my gosh. Just in no particular order. This was a jacket based on a pattern called the panel jacket, and you actually knit these individual strips in garter stitch, and each one is a different length, and then they are seamed together. And the original pattern was just all in a solid color, and I had bought some Noro yarn that was pretty, almost kind of gaudy, with a little glitz in it and so on, that I toned down with a more neutral kind of a denim blue. And I really was happy with the results that came out on this. I seamed it together in a method I learned from Priscilla Gibson Roberts in her Cowichan class, her Cowichan shoulder joints,
Uh-huh.
where you knit up stitches from both sides. And it's a fancy 3-needle bind off,
Right.
because the whole braid, and that all the joins are done with that.
Isn't that
And
amazing? That's beautiful.
And then the sleeves, again, I did the tapering in the top sections instead of the bottom. And then there's one long strip that becomes the shawl collar around. So it ended up, and then, much different than the original. And then I
Really
did this
nice.
braided I-cord, where you just are knitting two
Oh,
strips of
yes.
I-cord and alternating, attaching, and it's a pain in the butt to do because everything's getting tangled because you're always rotating it over. But the results are really,
The
really
results are
nice.
stunning.
Yeah.
Yes. Just
So,
beautiful.
so
Beautiful.
that here's the first pattern I ever had published, which was by Cast On. I entered this, that I had designed for my husband, who is a bird watcher, and it's was based. I found the buttons first. The buttons are, I don't know if we can
Oh,
see,
cute. Yes.
little
Yep.
brass owls.
Yep.
So I got graph paper out and designed the owls, and of course owls had to sit in trees. So this is my fair owl sweater,
Wow.
and it's based on Elizabeth Zimmerman's knit and set in sleeves. So you join the body and the tubes together, and and the sleeves tube together, underarm stitches on a holder, and then by the way the decreases angle, first into the body, then across the sleeve, and then there's a little bit of back and forth short rows here to finish off the sleeve caps, and then it's cut down the front.
That's stunning.
So that won the first place both in designed for men, and then also it was a co-winner for the best of show. So
Very
that,
cool.
and of course, when I knit it, I had no idea I was even going to enter it. So then when they called and said, okay, now we need the directions, they had to mail it
Oh
back
my
to me so
gosh.
I could try and, in magnifying glass count stitches and
Oh my
tell me
gosh.
one size, because, sizing something this intricate. So there was that. Here was a sweater I knit for my son when he was much, much younger. And he was the ball boy for the local high school Irish team. So I found, and the colors were green and white. And this was knit in the round. But what was kind of cool about this was the squared pattern was using this. There's 2 missing squares for the neck shaping. So I followed the parameters of the design. The armholes, is drop shoulder. And by picking up along the armhole that was cut and following the pattern, all I had to do is change my grid was square. My chart was square, was just pick up and go on down. And then because there's corrugated ribbing, and which is
Yes.
get one purl one, then see how that blends right into the single vertical
Right.
row stripes. And then
Right.
when you pick up and add the button band, it's garter stitch, but it blends exactly with the ribbing at the bottom.
Of course. Absolutely.
And then there's even a pocket
Yeah, I
there.
love the pockets.
Yeah, that was basically snip a stitch in the middle and unweave it in a solid color row. And then you knit a lining on the inside. And then there's I-cord to finish off the top. So I also do modifications on other patterns that, for instance, this was, I was going to look it up and I forgot, was a pattern in a magazine years ago, pullover, kind of a tunic style for myself. And I wanted to give it more of an A-line shape. So I found that by using different needle sizes as I went up, graduated it. The other thing was that I started the larger size at the hips, which because these panels are vertical, the larger sizes were just made by starting with 3 purl stitches. And then as I went up, I graduated and decreased down to 2, and then eventually to 1.
Yes.
So that it pulls it in, and that you have a tighter gauge up here where you get all the support anyway.
Right.
And then, so this was knit from the bottom up, because you get a much better scallop on feather and fan on the bottom. On the top, it tends to flatten itself out. But the sleeves, because I had a limited quantity of yarn, I picked up and did that top down so that I could go.
You could run out. Yes.
Right, and it ended up just right at wrist length. But here I did the decreasing. Do you see that stockinette wedge in between?
Right.
So I have a panel of lace under the arm and a panel of lace on top, and then that just graduated out to nothing.
Very nice.
So I can do my sleeve shapings in a variety of ways. Here's one where it's a modular sweater after I got a dose of Horst Schultz's patterns where he does things in modules. And there were vertical strips of diamonds. So you start with, I forget, 5 stitches or 3 stitches, and then you increase out and go back in, increase out. And then once you have it as tall as you want, you knit up stitches along the side in the solid black, and then knit a row back and have garter stitch, and then you cast on for the next one, and you work it back and forth and knit it together with the black so that this goes vertically around the sweater. And then the sleeves, I did different, each subsequent down by the cuff, each diamond is narrower. It never got as wide as the others, so that it automatically tapers the whole sleeve down.
So when you were doing those sleeves, because that changes the lengths of the diamonds too. The diamonds are narrower and shorter, and you need to come out with the right length for your sleeve.
Well, I left it to chance because I figured I
You
could
could
make this
cuff.
ribbing as long as I
Yeah,
wanted.
yeah,
Because I know I could have, sat there and laboriously calculated it all out, but I opted to just figure, okay, my sleeve cuff can be 2 inches, 1 inch, or 6 inches, whatever I needed to be to fill in the gap. So, and then the cool thing is I had either had cast-ons or binds off at the shoulders, but if you graft shoulders together over top, let's see if I can get that smoothed out, with a color that matches, it looks seamless across the
right,
top.
right,
So it looks like you've gone on over, but you actually have the bind off
right, for the
underneath
strength. Yeah,
for the support.
yes.
Exactly. Let's see, this Aran was one I did for Knitters Magazine way back, issue 16, I think. Their best and later was republished in the Best of Knitters Arans, and it's done top down. This one actually started with the ribbing, and then you extend down in a shoulder strap for
Right,
saddle sleeves, but you offset so that there's fewer stitches across the back of the neck, so you've left more down the front, because then after you do your shoulder straps out to the width, leave those stitches on a holder, come back, knit up stitches along the sides of the saddles, across the back of the neck and across the other, and then this is worked back down flat to underarm level. Come around to the front, you just do one at a side, one side at a time, so that you're picking up stitches along the strap here. And as you go back and forth, initially you want your front drop to go down pretty vertical, so you would just knit the last stitch together with a neck ribbing stitch. And then after a little while, you start increasing it so that it curves around. And then eventually you just pick up the remainder of the stitches, go down to the underarms, cast on enough stitches at the underarm. In this case, I did opt to do front and back separate. And speaking of seaming up my slip stitch selvage, this is the kind of effect I get. So it has a very decorative look, and it mimics, in this case, I also did a pattern where you just slip a stitch on
right.
garter background
To outline your cables, right.
to outline the cables.
Very
So,
nice.
yeah. So anyway, well, I could go on, but I didn't know how long you were going to.
Well, I think that let's see what else you have to see there, and then
Okay.
we'll see if there's any extra questions, and we'll
Okay.
bring it to a close.
I have, oh, this was a favorite. This was a jacket called Barnstormer Jacket that I sold. I think originally it was to Cascade Yarns. And it was based on Elizabeth Zimmerman's Hurry Up Last Minute Sweater in the December chapter of Knitter's Almanac. And in that, the whole premise of the Hurry Up Last Minute Sweater is in a very bulky yarn. So you could get one done the last couple of weeks before Christmas as a gift. And it was done in tubes, body and sleeves. And then the under, at the yoke, everything's joined together. And it looks somewhat like a raglan, only this comes completely to cut off all the body stitches.
Right.
And then eventually you do some decreasing at the top of the shoulder.
Right. So all the decreases are on the body, none are on the sleeve. So it pulls it in like this.
Well,
yes.
At the very end, there
right.
is a center
right.
in the sleeve there. But she says, do not try this in a thinner yarn. She says, I have tried and tried and tried, and I can't get the math to work out to a simple proportional thing to where you can say decrease at this rate.
Right.
And I had knit one of them, I think her gauge was something like 2 stitches to the inch or something. And I knit one at about 3 stitches to the inch, and I could see what she was getting at, because when I use the same formula, the shoulders were kind of making a bottleneck. It worked okay, but I know I couldn't have pushed it any further. So at some point I had the light bulb moment. Well, what if instead of doing it in stockinette, because the problem was the row gauge was too tall for the stitch gauge. What if I compress the row gauge? Aha, what compresses row gauge?
Garter stitch.
So I did the whole thing in garter stitch at worsted weight 5 to the inch. And this ended up, oh, good. Let's see if I can pull off of a quick change here and maybe even. Oop. It would help if I could aim right and hit into a sleeve. There we go.
Oh.
And then as long as I was playing with it, I'd done another one as a prototype initially and have taken it to camp, utterly triumphant. That was the fun thing about knitting camp is every year was show and tell.
Right.
People would come back. You could see knitting evolution taking place because somebody would say, I used so-and-so's idea, but then I tweaked this and I added their sleeve concept. But anyway.
That's beautiful.
Okay.
I love that.
So this has garter stitch Fair Isle or color patterns and garter stitch. My gosh. This would fit you great. The sleeves are really long.
Yeah.
You can see where the decrease lines are.
Yes.
They're coming down. I can pull this up a little bit more. And then the shoulders, because let's see. I got a hood on here. Because I widened the shoulders out, so the decreases are on either side of these epaulets that I basically made with a color branded pattern in it. And then there's also one on the very top of the hood, and of course one around the body and the sleeves. And then an I-cord goes around the entire sweater. I did it in the solid color, same body color as the.
That's beautiful.
With the cord on there, and then there's also a
it's so awesome when something that you envision works out.
Yeah, because you like I say, I had done a prototype before, but then the next one that I did for the pattern, I also wanted to do added the color work to add a little bit more pizzazz, because that much garter stitch, you have to be a sadist practically to force that. But on the very top of the hood, I've got a decal as well, because this is one of those. And I had fun with the hood too, because I've got the ribbing. Ribbing joins up the two lines, the converging lines of decreases in the back.
Yep.
And then it splits out and increases for the shaping of the hood.
Yeah.
And then at the very top, you're working back and forth on this and knitting the last stitch or purling the last stitch together, so it makes more of a chain along the join there. So,
and to me, those things, I'm really picky on those types of things too. Like I like my ribbing to go into the design, not just be, a lot of times ribbing looks like somebody cut a piece of fabric and sewed it on the bottom. It has no relationship to the rest of the sweater. My ribbing blends into my sweater. My ribbing matches my seams. Everything, the button bands, everything goes together like it should. It's not just cut and pasted on.
Right.
Super important. It just takes planning in advance instead of happenstance.
The one thing that I think could be really difficult now is for a lot of designers is that even if they are aware of that and want to,
the sizing,
bring so many sizes and getting it to work out with every single size. I mean, I can understand, because that takes a lot of planning to do it, and I'm just doing it for one size.
Exactly.
Well, back in the day when I, designed patterns, it was not unusual. Just 3 sizes was all they needed.
Right.
So it would work. Here was another fun pattern. This one was in Gathering of Lace, where I took a traditional style, the loose kofta, the lice jacket of Norway, and I interpreted a lace pattern to fit with the theme. But I was pleasantly surprised to see how easy it is to kind of, interplay different designs. Now, this does have a set in an indented armhole, so it's not a total drop shoulder. But, for many of us, that is a little bit more flattering.
Right.
And then I could replicate the lace by doing the eyelet, the turn eyelet collar
Nice
and the
neck.
body. Yeah. Yeah. So again, fun. And a lot of these, the body goes up and then the sleeves go down so that I can stop and adjust length as I'm going. A lot of my sweaters now, if there's, especially with plain bodies, I'll start provisionally on the body as well and go on. I might knit up one skein's worth and then I can calculate the area that that one skein gives me and extrapolate out for the total area to say, okay, this is going to work. I'll have plenty. Or, I better start thinking about color work to add in the yoke or someplace else. Or can I make this into a vest instead so that I know where I am and I don't get caught short? Because body length, then I'll pick up and do the body length down. It can be high hip, it can be medium hip, it can be down to your knees if you want, according to the amount of yarn you have.
Well, I think that we're going to wrap up. This has been very, very enjoyable. I could sit here and listen to you talk all afternoon. I just love it.
Eventually the ears might start ringing.
So let's see if anybody has, I'll give people a last chance to put in a question if they have one, or if I've missed any of your questions and I didn't see it and ask it earlier, go ahead and post it again. That way I don't have to scroll through all of the chat over here. So, and I love Margaret Snook says fair owl sweater for your husband's sweater. That was so cute. I just love that, her fair owl sweater. So I'm giving you a second here. I'm talking to take up a little bit of time. And if you have a question or comment that you'd like, Trevster says, it's such a pleasure to meet Joan. Thank you both so much. I think everybody really, really enjoyed this. And it's nice to put a face and your talking and your personality together with what people read that you post on Ravelry, Yeah,
I agree. And I was going to say, I think I recognize that name, Trevster. I think
yes.
we've been not too distant past discussing some issue or other. I can't pull it off the top of my head.
I interviewed him last week. And so if you wanted to go to my YouTube channel, you could see because he's
fair play.
Yes, he's very good too. So he in his own right. Okay, so everybody says thank you. Everybody says, Judy Snyder said, such a pleasure to listen into your conversation. L. Jansen wants to know if there's a pattern available for the panel jacket.
There has been in the past. Look on Ravelry.
It'll be in your projects, right? In Ravelry?
In my projects, and I think I did Joan's panel jacket or something pretty basic. Carol Lappin is the designer. And for a while, I knew it was available for free. I can't remember if the last time I checked, it still was.
But you know what? Even if patterns are $6, $8, you really get your money's worth. People knew how much effort it takes to design something and write a pattern.
Yeah.
Even if it's free, give them some money.
Yeah. The difficulty is if it isn't available, period.
Right.
Now, I know originally, I think it was in one of those Simply Shetland books. They're no longer in print, but it would. Somebody could do some tracking down and find it, on secondhand sale kind of thing too.
Right. But, on Amazon, they have used books. There's all kinds of eBay, all kinds of places where you can get used books.
Powell's bookstore up in Portland, not too far from me. Yeah, a lot of places.
We're going to wrap it up. This has been so enjoyable, Joan. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And
my pleasure. It's good to run into you again. I, of course, see you on YouTube. On many occasions have referred many people to your videos. But I do remember when we met way back when, and I thought to myself, that girl's going places. and there are times too when I see your videos, I think, now this is great. I don't have to make videos because she's doing it just the way I would and telling the same things I would.
Same line of thought.
You go.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And goodbye, everybody. And see you next week. Okay? Bye-bye. Okay.